My name is Andrea Desi. I am the scientific director of the NewMed Research Network. I'm also the head of the Italian Foreign Policy Program and a senior fellow within the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Africa program at the Rome-based Istituto Affari Internazionali, or International Affairs Institute. It is an extremely great pleasure to be here today with such esteemed colleagues and scholars. And I think that I'm particularly happy to be here today because finally, I believe that these topics and these discussions on climate change, on the implications, the multidimensional implications of climate change, are finally reaching a wider audience, not only in terms of the general public, which of course the last years have seen unprecedented mobilizations, but also at the institutional level within the European Union, within a whole number of international organizations. So I think that this is already a first positive bit of news, which I think is our responsibility to continue working on and continue building on for the future and for future generations particularly. Today we are focusing more closely on the Mediterranean, which, as Ambassador Mastroianni outlined excellently in his presentation, is recognized as a significant climate change hotspot. And I think that already the discussion that has been ongoing this morning or this afternoon in the previous panel has set the stage very well for the transfer into a new panel, on this panel number 2, in which we are going to be focusing on a more kind of restricted and more specific dimension of these implications between climate change and peace building. And therefore, we'll be speaking more about food insecurity, resource scarcity, and their relationship to climate change, and therefore also to conflict. I think we have already heard some interesting talks in terms of the importance of agriculture for the human species in general and for the development of the human species, and especially how the importance of the Mediterranean for these developments. So I think, again, we have had an excellent opening of the discussion and the works today, and I think we will be definitely building upon this further with our 2 esteemed speakers who will be joining us today for panel number 2. Before I open up the panel, I wanted to very briefly build on what Emiliano has already very perfectly said about NewMed, about the NewMed Research Network, which I create here at IAI, but together with esteemed colleagues from the Italian Foreign Ministry, from the OSCE Secretariat in Vienna, and as well also from the Compagnia San Paolo Foundation. Of course, these activities and this NewMed Research Network, which was founded back in 2014, and has therefore examined and worked on a whole number of various different issues, would not be possible without the support and assistance and the exchange of views and the exchange of academic interests as well among our partners. And I would include also, of course, the Agency for Peacebuilding, with whom we have partnered this year to help organize and set up the 2nd day of the Peacebuilding Forum. So my thanks do go to all of our supporters and our partners and in this endeavor. Now, briefly, this year within the NewMed Research Network, we are specifically focusing on climate change, and its security implications, its implications on sustainability, and also on the political questions, on the socio-economics, and therefore addressing climate change in 360 degrees approach. This approach is very close to and is definitely in synergy with the OSCE's own approaches, which the OSCE has a relatively unique approach to a comprehensive approach to security, and this matches very well with NewMed's idea, with NewMed's motto and mission, which is that of addressing Mediterranean dimensions not only from a European perspective and actually encouraging non-European perspectives on Mediterranean security, and working specifically on human security dimensions. Therefore, we do not only focus on the contemporary, on the crisis or the given crisis or the given conflict which is erupting before our eyes. And in these days, of course, our thoughts do go to what is happening in Palestine and Gaza. Of course, there are many other tragedies ongoing, including Syria, Yemen, Libya. But given the events that are happening within these days and within these hours in Gaza, I think our thoughts definitely are with them. But this approach of human security is very important because it opens up the discussion. It is no longer focused only on the hard security dimensions, but it brings in the soft security. Soft security is perhaps harder to gather interest in or gather excitement about, but it is very much just as important as the harder security dimensions. And I think that the Mediterranean region, both north and south, is experiencing and is in some ways a microcosm of the importance of adopting comprehensive security approaches to these challenges. And it is within this framework that together with the OSCE, together also with the Italian Foreign Ministry and with the Compagnia San Paolo, NewMed this year chose to develop a whole number of activities specifically focused on the environmental dimension of security. This is a dimension which, as Emiliano already mentioned, the OSCE is working on. It falls within the so-called second dimension of the OSCE. For this reason, we are partnering with a number of institutions, including also the Union for Mediterranean, for the organization of a number of research, outreach, and dissemination activities through which we hope to contribute to these debates and to generate new knowledge, which is not only European, but also non-Eurocentric in helping to address these issues, these important issues. So given that we have already run a bit over the original times, and I've been asked to be something of a relatively strict timekeeper, I would like to quickly introduce our first speaker in the panel today. Our first speaker is Dr. Yara Azli, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Central Florida. She is also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. Yara has written and will be presenting and will be kicking off the debate her preliminary research findings for a paper that, just as Professor Shefren's paper before, will be then published in a standalone edited volume jointly published by NewMed and the Agency for Peacebuilding, which will then be disseminated through social media and through the usual platforms. And I do encourage everyone, therefore, to stay tuned and to then download also the academic and the research component of this exercise. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Yara and thank her again for her participation. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everyone. Hello from Florida in the US. And thank you, of course, to the hosts for inviting me to this incredibly timely event. Before I start, I also want to express my solidarity with Palestinians across the occupied territories as they suffer yet another crisis. So for decades, the common wisdom in discussions of food insecurity was one of supply. Some people in some parts of the world don't have food, so let's send them some bags of food, let's help them build some greenhouses, and that should do it. And it is true that food aid has staved off hunger and famine for millions of people over decades. Yet food aid does not address the core causes of hunger: conflict and displacement, inefficient global food supply chains, and increasingly the effects of climate change. There is no region where this is more apparent than the Mediterranean, which hosts a disproportionate number of the world's conflicts and vulnerable people, and is also a region that is especially susceptible to the effects of climate change. The region is also the largest importer of food in the world. On top of these factors, consider that many of the countries in the Mediterranean, and especially in the Middle East, are outpacing the world average in terms of population growth, coupled with rapid urbanization from rural to urban areas. And of course, part of that region's dependence on oil gives many of its most powerful states a powerful disincentive to accelerate climate change mitigation efforts. So you could not pick a group of intersecting factors that were more poised to cause significant food insecurity and contribute to conflict than these. And that is what I will focus on in my talk today. So for years, there was speculation that climate change led to Syria's civil war. Perhaps this has already come up during the forum. Many influential world leaders posited this very theory. However, later research questioned the direct connection, but what is clear from copious literature is that food scarcity does cause tensions that can lead to violence or political instability. For example, There are cases across the Middle East or Africa where farmers who were suffering poor yields were more likely to lend support to extremist groups who promised them food, money, or land. These poor yields are typically caused by land degradation, drought, inefficient farming practices, and other factors that could be addressed by a forward-thinking and functional state. Yet, in the context of conflict, corruption, and political instability, the state is essentially rendered ineffective. Many of the states that are the focus of our discussion today are highly militarized and are led by authoritarians, authoritarian leaning leaders, or at best, elected leaders that are corrupt and ineffective. Food prices have gone up, currencies are being devalued, and there's also rising inflation across the region. These are all factors that these states are wholly unprepared to contend with. So this is the political context we find ourselves in. Now let's look at pre-existing food insecurity in the region and its causes. It is particularly ironic to consider that this region was once an agricultural hub when we consider that today there are more than 50 million hungry people in this region. 2/3 of these people live in conflict-affected territories. At the same time, there is significant food wasting in other parts of the region. Due to the desert-like conditions in many of these states for much of the year, it is already difficult to grow many crops, especially the water-intensive crops that are vital to the cuisines of these countries, such as wheat and lentils. Moving forward, the Mediterranean basin is projected to experience the greatest decline of projected rainfall of any region on Earth. And with most of the crops in this region rain fed, this will be a critical loss for crops, forests, and the region's important biodiversity. Land management is exceptionally poor, and poor health promotion efforts means that demand for foods with little nutritional value, such as packaged snacks, sodas, as well as foods with a high carbon footprint, like red meat and dairy, are also increasing. Already, population growth and the region's pre-existing climate have rendered it impossible for these states to produce all or even most of their needed food. So now let's consider the relationship with these factors and the topic of the day, of course, which is climate change. By 2050, it is estimated that climate change will cut in half the progress being made in reducing the number of malnourished children in this region. So you might be wondering how that is possible. What is the connection? There are several mechanisms with which climate change will exacerbate food insecurity in the region. First and most simply is, of course, high temperatures. Parts of the region may reach temperatures of up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit or around 50 degrees Celsius. Very few crops grow readily at these temperatures. Also, in higher temperatures, livestock are more likely to suffer from pests and disease. There is also higher risk for extreme weather events and disasters like floods, forest fires, and drought that ruin arable land or destroy crops that are growing. Desertification, which occurs when previously fertile land becomes desert, is also hastened by climate change, and we're already seeing this happen in parts of the region. There are already decreasing yields across all states of the Mediterranean, from Morocco to Italy to Syria to Egypt. Many farmers will no longer be able to sustain their livelihoods and will become unemployed or displaced. These effects, of course, are not limited to this region. Many of the crop producing nations from which these states import their foods are also likely to suffer from some degree of disrupted food production. This may lead to domestic food shortages and increased food prices across the board. So whether it's by the limited capacity of domestic production or the limited capacity to import needed foods, food availability in the region is going to be very difficult to sustain. And that's if we merely stay the current course. If the effects of climate change are not mitigated quickly enough, there simply will not be enough food in the region. Of course, the wealthy and the elite will procure the food that they need. And so you will have these large populations that are underserved, struggling to find food, and at the same time experiencing the reduced quality of life of living in a very hot, water scarce region that is now prone to extreme weather events. So this transitions us directly to discussion of conflict. What the research has suggested is that as conflict is a predictor of food insecurity is also a predictor of conflict. It is a vicious cycle that perpetuates as citizens grow more desperate. Further, parts of the region will simply become uninhabitable, so populations will be forced to migrate, often to city centers. And this was the theorized trajectory of Syria's road to its brutal civil war. Many marginalized people, all crowded together in a poorly governed state with militarized instincts and pre existing ethnic or political tensions, all the components for conflict are there. All it takes often is a single spark. We've already seen protests during heat waves when increased demand cuts off power. We've seen significant protests for increasing food prices. Authoritarian tendencies to crack down on dissent like this means that any one of these isolated protests, if escalated, could be yet another spark that leads to conflict. So I want to end on a slightly more optimistic note by talking about mitigation strategies. First and foremost, ending the conflicts and poor governments or governance that prevent many of these states from tackling these kinds of big picture issues is the most important factor. However, accomplishing that is far beyond the parameters of this talk. So beyond that, ensuring food security in conflict affected states as the effects of climate change become more apparent will require significant collaborative efforts to limit overall carbon emissions and rising global temperatures, as well as shifting farming and food supply chain practices today to be more sustainable. So first, all actors in the region are subject to scarce food supply. This is not limited to vulnerable populations, although they will be the hardest hit. Global and regional actors should focus on bringing warring parties together to tackle food scarcity issues, even in the most fragile environments. Coalescing around shared goals and outcomes may be more effective in peace building than focusing on areas of disagreement, which is our tendency. Second, reforms and adaptations to farming systems must be implemented to increase resilience. Farmers must be trained in evidence based practices like crop rotation, diversifying seed varieties, drip irrigation, agroforestry, and changing their growing beds. Countries should also shift to growing crops more suitable for the climates of this region, especially as they change, with less focus on water intensive crops that are already grown in insufficient quantities to sustain demand. Third, risk assessment practices need to be emphasized to identify areas of vulnerability and ensure consistent data collection. Many conflict affected environments do not have consistent data across any sector: education, health, the list goes on and on. Very frustrating for researchers. With limited resources, internal and external stakeholders must be able to assess areas of prioritization and increased need. Fourth, institutions in conflict affected states must be built to be able to transition to an area of growing food scarcity and significant shifts in food procurement. Policies in these states must reflect these realities. For example, subsidies on water allow wealthy states to water large patches of decorative green spaces, while vulnerable populations in the same area and sometimes the same state do not have suitable water to drink or for farming. This is not a local effort. Shifts in global food supply chains will be necessary, from growing food in suitable regions to finding ways to produce and ship food more efficiently and in ways that do not increase carbon emissions. Volatility in food prices must be addressed through assessing trade protections, strengthening markets in fragile states by building infrastructure, and again, providing reliable, consistent, and up to date information on crop yields, stocks, and availability. We also didn't even address the issue of so called climate refugees, which are not protected under international humanitarian law and will cause significant global disruptions, especially in the northern Mediterranean region. So while there are many strategies we can take and many approaches we can adopt, the most important yet most limited factor here is time. We can't make more of that, and we're running out of it quickly. I hope that this forum and events like it can pressure policymakers to adopt measures that will modernize their societies and protect from some of the worst outcomes of climate change. Thank you.